Hello, this is Wade Frazier. This is May 14th, 2026, 10:52 a.m. This will be my last post on the man I call Mr. Professor, Wayne. I did two previous posts on Wayne, and here comes the last one. So again, Wayne was really the hero of what happened in Ventura, and it cost him his life. And I was young enough and idealistic enough to survive. I mean, that's why I survived the experience. I was still able to pick up the pieces of my life. And Wayne did the best he could. Again, he was lucky to keep his legs. So again, his wife sent him to Mexico as his diabetes went out of control, probably from the stress of all those events. Saved his legs for the last decade of his life. So in 1992, 93, somewhere in there, I'm guessing 93, Wayne and his wife moved to North Dakota. Back to the family farm, lived on the family farm with Wayne's mother. And in fact, it was another house. So they bought a house. And it was a house, but it was like portable. So they actually they moved it. They bought it and then they moved it quite a few miles apparently, and they plopped it down on the in the farm in the yard. So they're surrounded by the fields of their farm. Um, and actually, I remember one day I called to talk to Wayne, and I got his mother instead, and had a delightful conversation with her for for a while, and it was obvious that how much she loved and cherished Wayne. And that was the only time that I talked to her. She got a stroke and was bedridden for the rest of her life. She didn't live too many years after that. And in 1994, so I was in Ohio working as the controller of a trucking company. And 94 was my best year there. Um, and anyway, my wife, in fact, this is when she had just finished, pretty much finished her studies for her doctorate. In fact, the next year she actually lived in Cincinnati in her, they call it internship. Anyway, it was the last stage of getting her doctorate. So we had a break. And so there in, I think it was September of 1994, and this was several months now after Dennis got out of prison. And I've discussed that in the past. We drove to North Dakota from Ohio, and it was fun. In fact, we visited when we were in Ohio. I belonged to the spiritual community there, and a bunch of them went and they joined actually a Course in Miracles cult in Wisconsin. We stopped by on the way, visited that, and that was mighty strange. Um, and uh, so anyway, so we drove there. In fact, remember we went through Minnesota. My wife would visit a friend in Minnesota, so it was a really nice trip. And again, weather was beautiful. And in fact, Wayne, the farm was surrounded by ripening sunflower fields, which actually in the company post, I have a picture of that. So yeah, this whole place was surrounded by sunflowers. It's quite a sight. Um, and me, so again, my journey, and I've written about it, talked about it, etc. So again, when I was 15, I got my energy dreams and stuff, and definitely my years with Dennis was the high abrasion, steepest learning curve of my life, the radicalizing experience, the kind of stuff that almost nobody ever lives through. But I was still trying to make it happen. So I haven't had anything really to do with Dennis. I've seen him three times the last 25 years. He's off doing his thing. I'm doing mine. And again, Dennis thinks if I can find 5,000 people who can learn to sing the song of abundance, it will work. So the love and enlightenment approach will work if enough people can be found to do it. That's the hard part. Um, and so I've been, in fact, what I do, some of my friends called it Wade's World, kind of play on Wayne's World, which in fact, and my stuff's been called Wayne's World for over 30 years, and I'm okay with that label. Um, so so I've never stopped. Again, my journey's always been forward. Again, I've always had this goal of changing the world, particularly healing the planet, healing humanity. Abundant, harmlessly produced energy is the key to that. And that's what my work's about, so people can understand that and also understand that the technology is on the planet today. Um, and I've had so many paranormal experiences, which I'll write about, talk about one of these days. But the voice in my head is changing my business studies and then leading me to Dennis's company. Those two events are way larger in life. In fact, even I have a hard time believing that happened. So I was always been my wage roll talk. I've always kind of done this. I'm always about moving forward to making that happen, even though rough journey. And so anyway, and Dennis got out of prison there in 1994. I wasn't planning on working with Dennis again. He kept trying to get me to work for him, but I didn't want to do that. Although I did a couple years later. And so my wage world talk about the world, about again the things the topics I discussed publicly. I was at Wayne's house at the family farm when I started doing my wage world talk, and Wayne didn't want to hear it. And yeah, and I said, Wayne, you don't. He goes, yeah. He goes, Wayne suffered so much from Ventura. Again, bankrupted, almost died. Um, he said, he really regretted what happened in Ventura. His suffering was so great that he really regretted it. So we didn't talk about Wayne's World for the rest of that trip, which was fine. And to give a little more flavor of Wayne's life, he and his wife, they had such plans for their lives, and they got a little out of them, but a lot of it didn't happen. And one of them was they want to have a family, and it turned out they couldn't have children, and so they decided to adopt. And the first one they adopted was a boy, and he was 5 years old when they adopted him out of an orphanage. They adopted him out of an orphanage. And then a little bit a year or two later, they adopted a girl who, and she was 7 at the time. And her mother was a biker chick, kind of like a Hell's Angel biker chick. And when she got to be 7, her mom said, I can't do this anymore, keep raising this daughter. So she put her up for adoption. So they ended up adopting this girl and this boy. Well, the boy, and Wayne told me one day, he said, and again, I've written about this childhood adversity. So childhood adversity ruins people. It affects their brain structure, etc. Yeah. So Wayne said by the time the kid was 5, he was ruined for life. So he was ruined. And so anyway, so Wayne Wayne and his wife did the best they could with this kid, but he was constant problem. In fact, again, as I mentioned previously, in Ventura, there just before Wayne left, his son was bounced into prison. Now, his son he was a troublemaker, let's say. So he was never the straight arrow, and a constant source of pain and agony for Wayne and his wife. And he got, but again, sending him to prison. In fact, Wayne's attorney was so surprised by the sentence that he asked, like, who's got it in for your son? And Wayne reasonably suspected that it was retribution. The Ventura County gangsters sent his son to prison as retribution for us standing up to them. So that's again one of the many prices that people that paid for all this. And Wayne spent, in fact, so after Wayne's bankrupted, etc., moving to the family farm, he still paid tens of thousands of dollars on legal fees for his son. His son couldn't. In fact, his son lived with him for a while. And he just had to go to the local bar and get into trouble and stuff. So this was this kid. And he was about, I don't know, a decade younger than me, I guess. And he eventually became, again, he literally went to North Dakota for a little while, but he couldn't leave in. He had to go back to Ventura, and he ended up becoming a homeless person in Ventura, living on the streets. And in fact, I keep in touch with Wayne's widow. And again, and every time we would talk, and I'd ask, about the family, et cetera. And the boy, she visited him, I'm going to say 4 years ago, something like 3 or 4 years ago, she visited him in Ventura, actually with her adopted daughter. They went to Ventura and visited him. And she said he looked like an old man, and he was maybe 52 or 53. But yeah, life on the streets ages you rather quickly. And so, anyway, he died. He died a couple years ago. He actually died. And so, like at age 55. And it was really sad to see his life. The daughter, though, she actually ended up, back when she got to be about 20, she decided to go find her mother, her biological mother, and see her. And so she did. She went over there to New York, and then it was like, end up seeing this, old biker chick, basically. And again, the smoke, I'm sure it's smoking and boozing and drug and all the rest of that stuff. And so actually, Wayne's wife, she asked them to come pick her up after her little misadventure finding her mother. And anyway, so she moved to North Dakota, had a couple of children who are now adults, and she lives with mother, and she lives with Wayne's widow today. So yeah, that has a happy ending, let's say. So and Wayne, again, Wayne would. Now, here's an example of the kind of practical jokes that Wayne would play. Again, this is how saints play practical jokes. So one of Wayne's practical jokes are when he lived back there in North Dakota, and I'm guessing, I don't know if it was before they moved or after back there, because Wayne was so debilitated. But with farm equipment, maybe you could do it. But one of Wayne's favorite practical jokes was he would have neighbors. And again, this is out in the middle of the plains of North Dakota, and and it's all farms, and so your nearest neighbor is a half mile away, kind of thing. And but they all knew each other, and so in the town, the so-called town there was 10 buildings, maybe. It had a gas station, uh, diner, bar kind of thing. That was like the hub of this little town, and which had I think less than 1,000 people in it. But anyway, so Wayne's neighbors. So come harvest season, and back then, what they raised in that area, again, he had sunflowers that year, but I know they would raise wheat, these kinds of things. And so again, it was mechanized farming. These kind of big monocrop mechanized farming. Well, anyway, so what Wayne did was that his neighbors, it'd be harvest season, but his neighbors would go. In fact, Minot, North Dakota, was the nearest kind of big city, and so they would go to Minot when they went to the big city, let's say. And anyway, so one of his neighbors, one neighboring farm, they left their home for a day or two to go to Minot, whatever. And so Wayne goes over to their house and gets all their gear going, and he harvests. He does their harvest, gets it all stacked up, pretty as you please, all ready to go to market. And then he sneaks back home. And then anyway, he got his jollies watching how dumbfounded his neighbors were. Kind of, you know, wondering what had happened. It was like Santa's elves came or something, right? My guess is that that town knew about Wayne and his so-called practical jokes. The jokes of a saint. So yeah, that's how Wayne got his jollies, was doing his neighbor's harvest for him secretly. But Wayne's father was an alcoholic, and so families and alcoholics. I can just imagine how dysfunctional a lot of the family dynamics were. And I know his father died a long time ago, and yeah, again, he was the oldest, so I think four. I think he had three younger sisters, as I recall. Maybe four, but I think it was three. And they all moved away. And then his last years, Wayne told me that his sisters accused him of stealing the family fortune or something, and they disowned him. And I can relate. So again, my attacks from my friends and family during my ride with Dennis. This was normal. And so this is saints, and this is kind of goes back to a prophet has no honor in their hometowns. Yeah, so Wayne's sisters, all they saw him was some guy who was horning in on the family fortune or something, which was not true, but yeah, that's how it was. And yeah, I have no contact with my immediate family, and Wayne didn't either. In fact, when he died, and I went to his funeral, his sisters weren't there, so I was the only so-called family that came to attend his funeral. Yeah, it was only and so again, his adopted daughter was there, and she had a couple kids, and her husband at the time, and then Wayne's widow. So anyway, and then uh Wayne, so I every month as I was working there in Ohio, I was cutting a check to Wayne every month, pay off my debt for the legal fund, and I only wish it was 10 times as much, and so it was just yeah. In fact, Wayne told me he really needed the money, so he wasn't destitute, but he was up against it there after the Ventura disaster, and um and so anyway, in '94, when Wayne really didn't want to hear any Wayne any more Wayne's World, um, when Dennis started barnstorming the country in '96, Wayne was right back in the cheerleading section. In fact, when I went to work for Dennis again later that year in '96, that's what I saw where Dennis had paid Yul Brown $250,000 for his commission, for Brown's gas shipment from China. And I also saw payments from Wayne. So Wayne was paying money into Dennis's operation. He couldn't help himself. So yeah, he just had to, that's Wayne. So yeah, once Dennis started flying again, Wayne was right there, first row in the cheerleading section and helping support the effort. Oh, Wayne. And so then when I was briefly with Dennis in '96, '97, Wayne came out and actually he stayed with me. In fact, he came out also for the Philadelphia show, as I've discussed in previous posts, and then he came out in the winter there of early '97. I'm going to say February, and he stayed with me for about 2 weeks. And each evening, again, my library today is like 3,000 volumes. My Kindle though is probably 1,000 are on my Kindle, only maybe 2,000 are in my physical copies. And so even then, I had pretty big library. Now that's the hardest part of my move is moving my library. And so anyway, my library was at where I lived there. Well, a lot of it was. I think some of it was still in storage. So I still stored most of my household in Ohio when I moved to work with Dennis in New Jersey, but I moved a lot of it to New Jersey with me. And all our really important, valuable stuff also. So anyway, so I was there with Wayne, and Wayne, I would call Wayne what's called a paleo conservative. Again, raised, teaching in, accounting, raised there in North Dakota, probably voted Republican his entire life, this kind of stuff. And then I call them paleo conservatives, and I have a lot of respect for the paleo conservative kind of viewpoint. To me, it's nothing, no political stripe sees the big picture, but I respect a lot about paleo conservatives. Well, anyways, so I think Wayne I got woken up from my Ventura experience. And I think Wayne did too. So when he stayed with me, he actually, off my bookcase, without any prompting from me, he picked off from the bookcase Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. And every night he read it. So he spent like an hour every evening reading Zinn's book, which surprised me. I mean, it was nice to see, but I wasn't encouraging Wayne to do that, but he did. And so anyway, so he was reading Zinn's book and I think actually when he got home, he bought a copy for himself, I think. Anyway, and then I remember when we were there, Wayne just said, Wade, you should do something like Zinn's doing, which is like everything you thought you knew isn't the accurate version. And so, well, that's kind of what I've been doing for 30 years. I mean, a big part of what I've been doing. So Wayne was really kind of the first person really to encourage me to do that. And so, and I have been. So anyway, and then after I left the operation in New Jersey, Dennis brought me out more than once to help with their accounting, getting their taxes done and stuff. So, and it was either 98 or 99. Dennis had me come out there. I was out there for a week, and Wayne was also there. And by this time, though, Wayne's health was really failing. He could no longer sleep lying down like he did, like he could in '96. In '96, he slept in the spare bedroom of mine. But then he couldn't sleep lying down, so he had to sleep in a recliner, kind of in a half sitting position. Um, and um, and I previously remarked about Wayne's lifelong love of the Lakers. So anyway, so Dennis, and again, I think I mentioned the facility, the building that was Dennis's operation was headquartered in those days. It was like this 5-story building. It's an amazing kind of building, and Dennis and his family like lived on the top floor too. And then like on the third floor or something, they had like a TV room, and it was a recliner. Well, anyway, that's where Wayne slept when I was there, and in the TV room was TV, and so Wayne was this lifelong Lakers fan. Again, he watched the Minneapolis Lakers barnstorming when he was a child, and he moved to Los Angeles about the same, moved to Southern California about the same time the Lakers moved to Los Angeles. So he was this lifelong Lakers fan, and I grew up a Lakers fan myself, as I grew up there in Southern California, listening to Chick Hearn, kind of like Vin Scully with the Dodgers, Chick Hearn with the Lakers. I went to bed listening to those guys for years in my childhood on the radio. Um, And when I was there, actually, it was again, it was in May or something. And it was playoff time, so the Lakers were playing. This is just before their three-peat they did in 2000, 2002. So, so anyway, it was 98 or 99. I'm thinking 98. I could be wrong, but yeah, I'm thinking it was 98. But so every evening, Wayne and I sat and watched Laker games together. Oh yeah, there were when we were there. There were like I don't know. There were a few Laker games when I was there. So Wayne and I got to share our love for watching the Lakers. In fact, again, this is an aside, but when I lived in LA back in the mid '80s, I got to see the Showtime Lakers. I was at half court, 2 rows back. Jack Nicholson was right over there, kind of thing, and that was amazing. In fact, I watched 2 Laker games from the floor, but this one was at half court. And to watch these giants play like that, the grace and the power and everything else by these giants was an unforgettable experience. Yeah, when you see that stuff up close, it was like, oh, that was incredible to watch the Lakers play. Again, it's Showtime Lakers, Magic, Kareem, worthy to see this stuff. And so anyway, so we watched all this these Laker games when I was there that week. And yeah, during the day I was working, doing their accounting, and I were watching the Lakers. That's the last time I saw Wayne alive, was then. And in fact, about a year or two later, Wayne's kidney started failing, and he went on to dialysis. Like I had plans. So Wayne was this again back when he was a millionaire, etc. He was this great white hunter, etc. So he would go to Alaska, and I could tell some amazing Alaska stories with Wayne up there in Alaska, fishing next to Kodiak bears, and again he shot a grizzly. Yeah, hunting's not my scene, but I get that if you're raised to do that, that's what he did. Um, and uh, and I wanted to take him on one last trip to Alaska, but his failing health, then he was on dialysis, so he couldn't travel when he was a dialysis patient. In fact, he needed a kidney. And Dennis and I both offered him our kidneys. And in fact, I think part of our pancreas also. And I wasn't the only former student who offered Wayne a kidney. This is who Wayne was. And so yeah, Dennis and I were both like, Wayne, you get a kidney from us. You can have a kidney. And Wayne turned it down. He turned all those offers down because he said I was only offered a kidney from somebody as old and useless as he was. And that's St. Wayne. So yeah, he wasn't going to let some younger person, sacrifice a kidney for him. So that was Wayne. I said there were a few young people like me who offered Wayne, again, former students and stuff, who offered a kidney to Wayne. He turned them all down. And I called Wayne every few months. So yeah, and in fact, after his wife died, she said that he really looked forward to those. So it was keeping him in the game, I would say. So he was, yeah, really happy when we talked. But in May 2002, if I can get through this without crying, I put some pause. Okay, gain my composure for the moment. Um, Man, May 2002, Wayne's wife called me to tell me Wayne had died. He just died. And I had talked to him only like a month earlier or something like that. And I was devastated. In fact, today I'm older than Wayne was when he died at age 67. And his life was shortened because he got involved with me. Yeah, this will. Yeah, the greatest sorrow of my journey was Wayne's early death, ruined life and early death. And his wife, Dwayne, and his wife always took pains to tell me that I was the last person they would blame for what happened in Ventura. And but I was still felt responsible. And again, back to a Christmas card to Wayne kicked all that off, and $1,000 gift to me, and oh, what it led to! Oh my God! So anyway, I was gonna go to I had to. My wife said you need to go to his funeral, so I did. And so I got on a plane and flew to North Dakota and drove. I thought I was in Grand Forks, maybe another town there. Anyway, so I flew to the airport, drove to the house. In fact, when I walked into the house, Wayne's widow was actually watching a Lakers game. In fact, I wonder how much Wayne had to do with that, as you'll see coming up. So, yeah, in fact, that was a playoff game, the epic series with the Sacramento Kings in 2002, the last of their three-peat. This was like the first game of that series, I recall. Um, yeah. Anyway, so that was there, and then again, Wayne's daughter, she moved. So soon after, um, I think when Wayne and his wife moved to North Dakota, their daughter was close behind them, and she lives there today. In fact, she lives with Wayne's widow today. So that's a happy, and I'm really happy. I'm really happy that happened. Um, And so I was the only so-called family that attended Wayne's funeral. And there was a pretty big crowd when he got at the funeral. There were, I don't know, 100 people, maybe more, um, of his community. Again, he was St. Wayne in his community. And, but I was the only person who really traveled to be there, as I recall. Um, and when I got there, so then the next day was what they call the viewing of the body. And so this is where as a funeral home, and Wayne was, in state, it was open coffin funeral. And so there he was, there was his corpse there in a coffin. He wore his trademark glasses that he wore like his whole life. So yeah, it was like his signature look, I guess, which so I'll get to this in a second. So anyway, so at the funeral home, it was Wayne's widow, her daughter, and her family, and me, and this was it at the viewing. I think we were it. I think we were the only people who showed up to the viewing, as I recall. Maybe somebody else, but I think that was it. And so, and I'm going to write about this more in the future, but everybody, as I learned when I was 16, as Brian O'Leary learned 5 years later, we all have psychic abilities. And so these are innate human abilities. They've sort of atrophied in our age of materialism, but they're real abilities. And for today's materialists to chalk up religions and stuff to a whole bunch of superstitious hocus pocus isn't quite accurate. there's certainly a lot of corruption in organized religion. In fact, what I call the fifth epic, organized religion, I don't think will survive. I don't think any of today's organized religions will survive in the fifth epic. What will replace them will be far more enlightened, and it won't be people trying to make a living off of religion, etc. Now that part's gonna go away. And again, and everybody's religion will be there'll be a universal religion. Again, one language, one culture, and again, death's not the end. We live forever, all this kind of stuff. And psychic abilities. In fact, Brian and he wrote about that, where white male professionals, in particular, because of the way we use our brains, they tend to have their psychic abilities that atrophy. And I was 16, so I hadn't had a chance to ossify yet when I had my first paranormal experiences. Brian was actually an old man at age 39 when he had his. And again, if you had to read Brian, Brian would have been the first poet in space as an astronaut. He wasn't normal astronaut material. And so that's probably why he took his path, was he wasn't your typical astronaut. Get on that rocket, soldier. He wasn't that kind of guy. Anyway, so we all have psychic abilities. I come from a family of some very gifted psychics, and I'm psychically talented, let's say. And as we'll get to here, I've chosen not to develop those abilities because of my journey. And I'll make a post of my paranormal experiences one of these days. Anyway, so here I am going to view Wayne's body now, and I so wanted to, bless him as much as possible. I was praying with all my might that he had a wonderful transition to the afterlife, etc. And so in the viewing room, and there was all these seatings, and we were, and there was a coffin up there in front, at the stage or whatever. And I was sitting, I don't know, 30 feet away, 40 feet away or something from the coffin, while Dennis, Wayne's widow, said goodbye to Wayne's body. And so while she was there, but I was praying, going in a deep meditative state, praying with all my might, blessing the whole thing as much as I could. And again, when I took the Silva course, got over 50 years ago, one of the things, it was kind of an add-in offshoot that the teacher taught us, was how to look at auras and stuff. And today I don't know if I can see auras any longer, but back then you could be trained to see auras. And I said I don't meditate every day, stuff. So it's like I maybe should, but I have my reasons. But it's there when I need it. That's kind of how I see this. And so then I needed it. So I was praying with all my might. In fact, I saw Wayne. In fact, I saw like him in his. I saw him like in his heaven, and it turned out that he looked the same, though. And anyway. Then at the funeral home, they actually had a picture of Wayne, like from his 20s. Well, he looked the same as he did when he was 60. The same glasses, same haircut, same Wayne. So, and in fact, when people pass over, they usually take on the appearance of when they're in their prime, generally in their 20s or 30s. And so, anyway, so I saw Wayne as he looked in his 20s, but it looked very similar to how he looked when he was in his 50s and 60s. And so, so I remember seeing that, and I just remember, oh, okay, why doesn't he look different? And then I actually saw his heaven. I glimpsed his heaven, and it was a cross between North Dakota and Alaska. So it was the plains of North Dakota and the mountains of Alaska. And I can still see this image of what I saw of his heaven. And so that'll stay with me. And so while Wayne's widow was there up next to Wayne's coffin, saying her goodbyes to him, man, I was praying with all my might. And again, like seeing orders. So often you can see things with your eyes open, and I did. And so I was seeing her, and it's kind of like you're seeing with your eyes and kind of not. You're kind of seeing with your third eye. Anyway, when Wayne's widow was standing next to his body, I saw just to the left, I mean, right next to the coffin, I saw 4 columns of light. And it was kind of reddish gold columns of light. And there were two, which were about the size of a human. And again, about this big around, probably about the height and the width of a human. Were 2 columns of light. And next to them were 2 columns of light, which were twice as high and twice as big. And I saw that. And when I saw that, my intuition, again, this is how different psychics have different ways of getting their information. And anyway, when I saw that, all of a sudden it flashed in my mind that I was seeing the 2 smaller columns was Wayne and his mother, and the taller column were angels. And so anyway, I saw this, and it was just like, okay, so this was what I saw. Anyway, and then what happened was that she got done. Wayne's wife got done saying her goodbyes to his body, and then it was my turn. And so I walked up to the coffin, and actually, I remember I touched Wayne's head, which is an intimate gesture that we never did in life, but I needed to, so I touched him. And then, as I was sitting there looking at his broken, dead body, the voice in my head chimed in. Now, the only 2 previous times in my life when I had that voice in my head is when I asked for it, when I actually felt backed into a corner. And this is, again, I'm this puppet on strings from my so-called friends. And the first time was to change my studies from science to business there in 1977. And the second time was in 1986 when the voice told me to move to Seattle. And 10 days later, I'm interviewing at Dennis's company, which I still have a hard time even believing that happened. And I lived through it. So I get that. Well, anyway, this time, as I'm just finished, I think I just finished touching Wayne, looking at his body, the voice in my head goes, the first time I talked to you and told you to change your studies from science to business, it was also to meet him. And I'm like, oh, gee, thanks. Here I am. His life was ruined and shortened because he got involved with me, and the voice is sort of taking credit for it all, saying, yes, I led you to him. And I didn't, my react, and anyway, I don't know if it was that moment or that day, but eventually I got very angry with that voice. And it's just like, you got any other fools for your suicide missions? Find some other fool for your suicide missions, man. This was some tough medicine to be told that at his coffin. And I haven't heard from the voice again, and I kind of don't want to. Now I've got any more bright ideas like that. In the end, I can't regret my journey, but it's like to hear that then. That was some tough stuff. In fact, it sent me into the dark phase of my midlife crisis for the next 4 years. And that was the event that propelled me into the dark phase of my midlife crisis. So yeah, I was unhappy. And anyway, so also what happened though was, and again, people can when I'm saying, people can go, oh, well, that's, Wade's imagining or whatever. Well, here's something that isn't so imaginative. So while his widow was next to his body and I was praying again, I saw, again, during that funeral, at that funeral home, I saw him in his heaven. I saw his heaven, and I saw the columns of light, and I was praying with all my might. And as I was sitting there praying like this, my eyes closed, as his wife saying goodbye to his body, suddenly I get this vision that came out of nowhere. I didn't know what it meant. In fact, I'm gonna show what the closest thing that it looked like carrying this. So, in fact, this is the Crowley Thoth Tarot deck, but the Ace of Cups. So look at the Ace of Cups, and sort of like this horizon line, or that is. The scene I saw, it looked kind of like, well, it's kind of sort of like that, And what it was this scene where I was overlooking like a plain or an ocean. But there's this long plain, and there's a distant horizon, and and the sky was just pitch black. But on the horizon, it was this line of light, and it was like it was brightening. So it was like just before sunrise or just after sunset. I know it was dramatic. It was this, again, it was heavily stylized, kind of like this. It was this, and, I'll have this in my dying breath. This vision of this again, this kind of night, this dawn or sunset scene. And again, super. And the contrast was like it wasn't real in a way, right? It was the sky was so dark and the horizon was so bright that in reality you wouldn't see something like that. The sky would have been brightened so much. So anyway, it was this really dark sky and this really bright sliver on the horizon. And I didn't know what it meant. So anyway, I can't remember if it was that day when we got back, or maybe it was the next day after his funeral. But at Wayne's home, so with his widow now, um, we were again. I talked about the funeral and my visit, and I asked her. I said I got the when I was there at the funeral home. I got this scene in my mind, which had this again, just like I described. And I said, "Do you know what it means? Because I don't know what that means." And she said, "You just described the scene where Wayne felt the most spiritual in his life." Yeah. And so, in fact, when in Ventura, Wayne lived in a canyon, so he couldn't see the ocean, et cetera, from where he lived. And there in Ohio and in North Dakota, it's all plain, right? It's flat in every direction for a zillion miles. And so, Wayne grew up in North Dakota, and sunrises and sunsets. It was like that was his religious time of day, was sunrises and sunsets. And when he lived in Ventura, he really missed it. So when he moved back to North Dakota, this was something that was one of the highlights of him moving back to North Dakota was the sunrises and sunsets. And so Wayne's widow said he would often, when it was in late in the afternoon, he would get in his truck and drive out in the fields somewhere and sit there and watch the sunset and watch the sun go down and drive back at night. And then also he'd do it in the morning. So he was again, he'd do fishing. The last 10 years of life, he'd do fishing. So long day of fishing, same thing. He'd be up before dawn and he'd be sitting there watching the dawn. Yeah. So Wayne sent that vision to me. So I was like, that was one of those, again, I've had so many moments like that in my lifetime. It was like, okay, that's what it means then. Okay. So Wayne was sending me this vision of, and he was telling me he's okay, and so anyway, that was really something when his widow told me that because I had no idea. I had no idea what that scene meant. And it was this vivid scene that I'll never forget. So yeah. So all those, the columns is in his heaven, all that happened within a half hour time frame, something like that. So anyway, that was my visit at the funeral home. Believe it or not. But again, it really his death really sent me into the dark phase of midlife crisis. It was tough. And a few years later, I started making big money in high tech, and in fact, I flew out his widow to to Seattle. She stayed with us for a week, and she saw relatives. We took her to Canada. We toured the Pacific Northwest, had a great time. In fact, I saw her in my 2000. Well, I'm gonna get to this in my 2013. So after 10 years of my high tech company, I needed a break. Those are dog years. Like I ended up losing my job because I took a sabbatical. But to begin my sabbatical, I did a road trip. In fact, for the previous 10 years, I just worked. And so, yeah, 60 hours a week was the standard for the next, for 10 years. That's my career. That's how it works, unfortunately. Um, And uh, in 2013, I did this 9,000-mile road trip where I started off in Seattle, drove across the northern United States, drove again. I saw my aunt and cousin in Spokane. I saw a guy who used to work for me who lived in Great Falls, Montana, North Dakota, had friends in Minnesota, Michigan, Toronto, upstate New York, New Hampshire. Again, spent, in fact, the last time I saw Dennis's wife in 2013, spent the weekend with them there in New Jersey. Again, and then came back down the southern route, back through Albuquerque and then up through Vegas and all the way up. It was a 9,000-mile loop that took a month. And some days I drove 700 miles in a day. I did that like 3 different days. I drove 700 miles in one day. In fact, this is one of them. So when I stayed at my friend in Great Falls, the next stop was Wayne's widow. And she'd actually, the year before, she had sold their farm. She sold the farm and moved to a town about an hour away. And so that was giving me a 700-mile day from Great Falls to her home was a 700-mile day. I had my new Outback, Subaru Outback, and it was quite a trip, bucket list trip. Yeah, I'll never do that again. And anyway, that day though, from Great Falls, and this was in late May of again 2013, and that 700-mile drive that day, it dumped rain like the whole time. It was grueling. Yeah, drive 700 miles in a rainstorm. In fact, actually, when I moved to work with Dennis, I actually did the same thing where I actually had a U-Haul truck towing my Pinto behind it with my cats. One of them was going crazy next to me, and I drove all night long. And again, the same thing. It must have rained must have dumped 5 inches of rain on my drive to New Jersey from Ohio. Well, this was the next day. This was the only other day I've had like that where I drove 700 miles through just torrential rains. Every time I semi-passed the other side, literally a tidal wave washed over my car and stuff. It was really something. It was grueling. It was a grueling drive that day. And well, anyway, I was going to see the widow, but on the way to her home, it was only a short 20-mile detour to go back to Wayne's family farm and visit Wayne's grave. And so this was always on my agenda to visit Wayne's grave. And so I did. In fact, I went to the farm. In fact, I was just watching footage. I took video footage of this visit to his grave and the farm. And yeah, and it stopped raining when I got there. It just stopped raining, but the wind was howling. It had been raining a ton. Again, torrential rains that day. And in fact, I couldn't initially find the cemetery. It was only about a mile away from the farm. In fact, their farm, it was abandoned. So they sold it, but nobody lived there that I saw. But it was their home that they lived in. And I actually had to go into town, went to that gas station, diner, bar kind of place I think it was a gas there, to ask directions to the cemetery. And they directed me, and I finally found the cemetery. And the cemetery looked different because when I was there, when Wayne was buried, it was like an open grave with all the equipment to lower the coffin and a bunch of cars and a bunch of people and stuff. And when I was there, it was deserted. There was nobody within a mile of me as I visited the cemetery. And it was, in fact, the footage, yeah. So it had been raining, torrential rain all day long, and they hadn't mowed the lawn for a while, so the grass was about yay thick or something. And on the way that day, it's like, here it comes, I'm going to visit Wayne's grave, and I don't want to use the word ominous, but it was something that I felt it would be a somber experience to visit his grave. I almost wasn't looking forward to it. Yeah, I don't know if I would have a cry at his graveside. I didn't know. And actually, a decade earlier, or actually 20 years earlier, again, my father's side. So my grandfather was born and raised in Kansas and lived on a homestead, etc. And I've been twice in 1994 yeah, 94 again, I visited with my favorite aunt. We visited Kansas together, and then I took my aunt out there for her last visit after he had died, and this was in 2010 or something. And my family, my ancestors are buried in these cemeteries out in the middle of nowhere in Kansas. And I sat on my great great grandfather's headstone one day, and then again in May when it's the most beautiful there. And I remember just sitting there meditating and thinking about his life and thinking about his life there on the plains. But he died during the Dust Bowl, which my grandfather said was a grim end for him. But I just remember, and then also thinking, of course, about the Indians who lived there beforehand. And in fact, the Megafauna lived there before the Indians. And yeah, so I was doing all that kind of thinking. Um, and anyways, that was really a blessed experience to sit on my great great grandfather's headstone and look across at the prairie there in Kansas, in the middle of nowhere. I mean, nobody's within a mile of where I was. And this was a similar situation. Nobody's within a mile of where I am visiting the cemetery. And it took me and it was again, it was I thought again, I was somber. I felt the duty to do this, and I actually am not sure what I thought I was going to do, except visit his grave. So anyway, there I am after this. I'd driven 650 miles or something so far that day, and I get out of the car, and again the grass is like it's wet. Again, it's torrential rains and stuff. So I'm wandering around. It took me several minutes to find his grave. And by that time, my shoes were soaked, my pants were soaked. The wind's blowing pretty hard. In fact, the video I have, you can see the grass waving in there. So it was really windy. I was wet, tired. Wasn't that cold, but kind of. Again, it was not a nice weather to do this in. And I find his grave. And I thought maybe I would sit on his headstone. In fact, I don't think I did. Maybe I did. But once I found his grave and stood there next to his grave, something entirely unexpected happened, which has actually never happened in my life before or since. So I was there as this, again, this solemn visit to Wayne's gravesite. And all of us out of nowhere, again, this is hard to explain. But the next thing I know, I am overcome with waves of joy. Yeah, joy. All this joy. And in fact, I'm starting to dance. I'm actually dancing on Wayne's grave. Happy. Again, it was these waves of joy that came from, I don't know where they came from, because this is not the attitude I approached his grave with. And it was just these waves of joy. Yeah, I was just like, it was incredible. In fact, I have to think about it. I hadn't had joy like that. In fact, in my lifetime, I've really had joy like that. It was unreal, and it lasted for a few minutes. And I was just like, all of a sudden, I'm almost giddy with joy, and it's like, what the heck? Well, anyway, I don't think I figured it out that day. Or I'm not sure I discussed it when I saw his widow. An hour later, I saw his widow. But that was Wayne. That was Wayne coming through once again at his grave. And I think he was trying to uplift me. Okay, and to let me know that it's okay. It was like he was, it was okay. Yeah, for me not to feel so badly about him. And in my studies, it's like if we have a lot of sorrow about the departed, it actually helps keep them tethered to the physical plane. So it actually not feeling sorrow for people who have passed on, no matter how tragic their ends may have been, they would wish we would send them off with love and not be so sorrowfully attached to their memories. I've seen this. And so I think that was his attempt to do that. And it kind of worked. So ever since then, when I think about Wayne, it's not as much sorrow as I used to have. So it's still tough medicine, It's all tough medicine for me, but I really don't have a yeah, I have much happier thoughts now when I think of Wayne. So so yeah, and I don't it was afterward. I don't think it was that day, but it may have been during that road trip still, but sat and thought about that. I said, that sure was strange. And I realized then it was Wayne again. It was Wayne coming through. So in fact in the early 90s, like May 94 actually, 93, 94, I actually had and I had many I've been to uh, more than 50 channeled sessions. I've had many psychic readings. I do, again, actually, a family friend wants me to read tarot for her because I've done it before, which I haven't done for a while. But she thought the previous reading was so great that she wants me to do it again. I don't know. It's in the cards, right? Anyway, so I had a reading with Joya Pope, who is actually one of the more famous Michael channels, and that was an amazing session with her, phone session. I was in Ohio, she was in wherever she lives, and it was for an hour. It was like this reading. In fact, I sent her photographs, a whole package of photographs of people, and she would read and tell me about my relationship with them. And I think it was that session. In fact, I have a tape of the session. I need to digitize it one of these days. Um, she said that Wayne and I have what's called philanthropic karma, which is so a lot of karmic connections people have is, again, what are called karmic ribbons are when one individual violates the free will of another individual in a way that harms them. That creates what's called a karmic ribbon. And we will balance every karmic ribbon before that's what our souls it's one way souls grow. It's one way they learn. This is what the physical plane's about. And so there's better ways to learn than killing and being killed. So it's beyond the scope of today's discussion. But what she said was that Wayne and I have what's called philanthropic karma, which is the karma that is from a mutual appreciation in that we're doing good work together, trying to save the world kind of stuff. And so, and there's nothing, the arrival of the fifth epoch will be the biggest event in the human journey. And Wayne never really, he died really before I really, actually was introduced to Bucky Fuller's work, realized I was a comprehensivist, and my work ever since has been much more comprehensive. Wayne died before, I started coming up with epics of the human journey and all that kind of stuff. But even when I was 15, I had a good idea of what revolutionizing energy industry would be. And before I became Dennis's partner, I had a very good idea of what the potential of free energy would be for the transformative effects of the human journey. And in fact, I've written about this quite a bit. Is like actually my vision 40 years later hasn't changed a whole lot, really. What I call the fifth ethic today, these are just visions that I had when I was, again, 40 years ago of what free energy could mean to the world. I mean, I've fleshed it out more, et cetera, but the basics are still the same. A world of abundance, a world where fear is banished, a world of love. And so, anyway, so Wayne and I have philanthropic karma around that effort. So anyway, when Wayne came through like that, it was his way of saying, wait, it's okay. Okay, I get that. And I'll see him. Also, and again, I've read, I linked to some of this. I linked to some of this again in the accompanying post. Again, I became quite the student of spirituality. Again, I don't suggest that people read spiritual literature before they've had paranormal experiences. You have to have paranormal, again, experience first, study later, because you need the experience. Otherwise, it's just this dry intellectual exercise. Once you've had paranormal experiences, all of those studies take on a very different character. And I've read, in fact, there's the best repository on the internet, which I've seen several books have written about. It's the best on the internet. There's a repository of and near-death experiences which people have had. And there's several hundred actually of their exceptional experiences. And I've read them all over the last 20 years. I've read many channel books. Read again. The mystical channel spiritual section of my library is the biggest single one, I would say. Biggest single section is that. Um, and anyway, when we pass over, um, we are greeted. Uh, dark pathers have a different greeting. So if you people who live lives on the dark path, their afterlives are not very pleasant. But for most people, well, again, 95% of humanity is they're not consciously trying to be bad people. Okay, they're not devoted dark pathers, and so that when they pass over, it's a pretty pleasant transition. Okay, and quite often when you pass over, you're usually met by somebody. And and I've seen it's often one being. Sometimes it's like an angel, or Jesus or whatever. But usually, I've seen this. Like I've read I've read hundreds and hundreds of accounts of near-death experiences, etc., and afterlife dictations from the afterlife, etc. And when we pass over, we're usually met by a loved one, somebody who we're really close to in the life that just ended, and who had passed over before us. And they're sort of like they're the welcoming and orientation role. And so they're like, "Hey, welcome to the afterlife, and here, let me show you some stuff." And quite often, it's kind of a party you wouldn't believe when you get reunited with all your loved ones, and a lot of them that you never knew in this lifetime, but they were your great great grandfather, this kind of thing. Uh, but in fact, last year when I saw Dennis, I talked to him about, Dennis. I'm not a Christian. Dennis is, but he's about enlightened as a Christian as I've seen. And I talked about when you pass over to the afterlife, you'll have this kind of welcome wagon kind of thing. And I said, you'll be greeted by somebody who is really close to you in this lifetime. And Dennis was certain it would be his dead wife, Allison, who passed here just a few years ago. So he said, she's going to be the one. And then he said, and he said, the next thing I was going to want to meet Jesus. And I'll go, you know what? And you will. So yeah, meet your dead wife and then go meet Jesus. Then meet God. So anyway, I wonder, and I've wondered this for a long time. In fact, probably since that graveside visitation, let's call it, that when I pass over, is it going to be Wayne? Is he going to be the guy who greased me? I don't know. Maybe. Could be Wayne. Might be somebody else, but he'll be there. He'll be there in the crowd. So, and I look forward to that reunion. And hopefully I will meet him after my job is done and we live in the fifth epoch. That would be the best. That would be the happiest of endings. Yeah. Yeah, I will go happily if the fifth epoch arrives while I'm still alive. Not counting on it. It'd be just bonus material. So that ends my story with Wayne. I was gonna see his widow last year. I didn't. The stars didn't line up. Maybe this year I'll go see her. Yeah, that's a top of my list to visit his widow again. And oh my, yeah, I just heard from Dennis. Actually, anyway, Dennis is in jail as I talk about this. So anyway, I'm going to hear about it soon. Uh-oh. Indiana Jones. It's still Indiana Jonesing. So again, after that graveside event, I'm not as nearly as sorrowful when I think of Wayne. I think really a lot more happily of Wayne. The man was a saint. Definitely, the angels were lined up with trumpets 10 deep when he passed over. But I don't want to bury anybody else whose life got wrecked because they got involved with me. And this is kind of why I take it as slow as I do. It's kind of why people think I'm not doing a whole lot. Well, I'm looking for people who can learn to sing the song with me. That's all I'm looking for. People who can learn to sing the song with me. Learn how to think comprehensively and sing the song of abundance. And my experience has been they have to be what I call disillusioned idealists, because their idealists meant their heart was in the right place, and disillusionment meant they woke up from the illusion of their indoctrination and conditioning. Wayne was a classic disillusioned idealist. But yeah, what happened to Ventura thoroughly disillusioned him about how our world really works. And so, again, I was young enough do what I've been doing now for the last almost 40 years, which is understand why the world is the way it is and understand how it can be, how I can help manifest the fifth epic, how we can help manifest the fifth epic. If I can find the people that I see, those disillusioned idealists, but I don't want to bury any more of them. So that's it for me and Wayne. So, bye for now.